Hello and welcome to By the Book. I'm your host, Joe Hebert. Today we continue our course on truth, justice, and leadership with the study of Machiavelli's Prince, and we will be going through chapters 15 through 18. So in previous episodes, we saw that Machiavelli's book is about the actions of great men. Greatness for Machiavelli, or virtue as he calls it, is maximizing our ability to acquire what we desire. And the greatest men of history for Machiavelli are those who acquired the most empire and glory. And they did so by achieving not simply having earthly power over others in a political state, but also by influencing the beliefs of their peoples so that their power and their influence would only increase after their death. In the generations that followed, the empire grew, the belief system that they inculcated grew, and therefore their glory and reputation grew with it. And we've seen that for Machiavelli, it's not the content of that belief system, and it's not the content of the laws that matters for him. It's their efficacy in obtaining power and enhancing power and maintaining and expanding power. So that's his analysis, and there's two obstacles to achieving this. One is any sense of moral limits, and we'll see today that Machiavelli is going to delve deeper into his understanding of morality in the middle of his book, and give us more of an overview of his nuanced thinking about it. But essentially, morality in itself is not important. It's only important as a smokescreen or a facade that one uses to enhance one's power. But one has to do immoral things in order to obtain power, and we'll see some detail about that today. Also, the other major obstacle is the church. Now, the church is a problem in a negative sense because it competes for power with princes or rulers. And so it diminishes their power. Anything that diminishes your power is bad, according to Machiavelli. But also, in the positive sense, we see his greatest heroes are men who were considered to be the friends of God or have some special relationship with God. So in other words, religion is a part of the ideal for Machiavelli, but it's a religion that has to strictly serve the interests of the state. So his positive vision is going to be not simply opposing the church as it currently exists, but having some kind of new belief system that can replace it and that can support his political plans. So we've seen some of his strategic thinking about this. First of all, the prince has to ally himself to the people, and he has to pose as the defender of the people. Even though his goal is to have power over the people, he has to represent anybody else who seeks power or influence as an enemy of the people, so he can be the defender of the people. And this would apply to other princes, other potential princes and rulers. It would apply to the church. And we've seen that his general strategy is that one has to rely upon oneself and one's own. So for oneself, it's that virtue that he's been talking about. But for one's own, he means one's own people, one's own troops in the military, the people and the places and the things that one can have maximum control over have to be sort of like a fortress that one builds one's power upon. And so as he goes through that, we see that a major part of Machiavelli's plan in this alliance with the people will be to present the church as an enemy of the people in its current form, and then try to work out some kind of a new form of religion where that's going to be under the prince's control. And so the Pope and the cardinals keep coming up as problems because they're an independent power structure that operates at cross purposes with princes. So those clearly have to go or be drastically modified to be compatible with Machiavelli's views. So now we're going to get into the heart of the book, chapters 15 through 18, where Machiavelli is going to, in a sense, kind of reflect how his thinking compares and contrasts to the thinking of other philosophers. We're going to be looking at these other philosophers later in the course. So for now, we just want to see how does Machiavelli indicate his awareness of these contrary theories, and how does he respond to them here in the middle of his book. So as we dig into chapter 15, I want to note that there are two basic things that Machiavelli is doing here in this book. Maybe I'll start with what he's not doing. As noted, Machiavelli does not engage in a dialogue or argumentation with his opponents. And we'll see that here. When he confronts his opponents, philosophical opponents, he is not going to name their names. He's not going to actually quote anything they say. He will misrepresent what they teach, actually. And he's not interested in some kind of actual debate here. So what is he doing? I think that for his understanding readers, he is trying to further clarify his position, but also he is trying to teach his readers a rhetorical strategy for how to deal with these other philosophical systems, because he knows they're not simply going to disappear. They'll be on the library shelves, they'll be out there, people will be aware of them. So how is he going to respond, but how is he teaching us to respond to those other theories, to be able to respond to them without having to get into a back and forth debate? That's how I would really characterize what he's up to here. So in chapter 15, he's talking about those things for which men, and especially princes, are praised or blamed. So this kind of sends us back to chapter 3, where he had said, if you succeed at acquiring what you desire, you will be praised and not blamed. And he's going to uphold that here. So ultimately, this chapter is reinforcing his rejection of morality and saying it doesn't really matter. But he is going to get a lot more nuanced here, both in terms of why he looks at it that way, but also what kind of a delicate balancing act does a prince need to do to pretend to be moral without being moral. Because every time you pretend to be moral, you seem to be supporting that concept of morality. And if that concept of morality is not helpful to you, that is a potential pitfall. Because certainly if you believe in it, you're leading yourself astray, but also you're encouraging other people to believe in that morality, even though you're violating it. So you seem to be setting yourself up for trouble. And it does seem like it's maybe an imprudent thing to do. So here we're going to get some much more detailed guidance on how this works in his mind. And first of all, he begins with this kind of backhanded acknowledgement of his philosophic opponents. Again, he's not going to name them or actually engage with them. But he does say, well, maybe I could be held to be presumptuous because in disputing on these matters, I depart from the orders of others. No kidding. That's pretty clear by this point. It's an understatement. But again, how is he actually going to articulate a response? He begins by saying that the reason I'm doing this is very simple. It's because my intent is to write something useful to whoever understands it. So notice how insulting that is, first of all, to contrary theories. The only reason I'm departing from those theories is because I'm trying to do something useful. And this is very characteristic of Machiavelli. It's not an argument, right? He doesn't even outline those theories or show how they're not useful. He doesn't even claim to prove that they're not useful. He just makes a very sneering comment about how useless they are. And that is going to be characteristic of his way of dealing with philosophical opponents and the way he's teaching us to deal with philosophical opponents. Basically to blow them off. But the rhetoric of doing it is very important, the rhetoric of utility. So he says, in a negative sense, I wanted to do something useful. They're useless. That's why I'm abandoning them. And so what is he going to offer? He says, I'm going directly to the effectual truth of the thing rather than to the imagination of it. So he sets up a dichotomy between the effectual truth, the practical truth, in other words. And this is a very interesting concept because truth in itself is traditionally understood to be a theoretical concept. The truth is a correspondence between the mind and reality. So when I think something that accurately reflects the way things are, that's truth. And that's a theoretical, question. Okay, it's not unrelated to practice because if I'm doing something practical, there are questions about the nature of reality that I need to answer. And so truth can be a step towards practical decision making. But Machiavelli reduces truth down to practice somehow. And we're starting and looking at his theory, we're starting to get into something that I'm just going to say for myself, having studied Machiavelli to the extent I have for a couple of decades plus, we're running into things that are paradoxical at best and potentially actual contradictions in his thinking. So I'm going to try to be cautious about whether these things are paradoxes or contradictions at this point in the course. We'll be coming back to that question repeatedly as we summarize Machiavelli and as we look at contrary theories and the critiques of Machiavelli that we're going to look at. But what I mean in this case is the paradox or the contradiction is Machiavelli is essentially telling us that the way things are is that the way things are doesn't matter. In other words, we only care about the results, not about the theoretical truth, and that's the way it really is. But by saying that's how it is, that is an appeal to the theoretical truth, right? So this is an example of a Machiavellian paradox. The theoretical truth is that theoretical truth doesn't really matter. And that's the first step in his self-justification, which, as noted, is going to also be his template for how future Machiavellians are going to operate, how they're going to obtain influence in the world. We don't care about the theoretical truth. We only care about the practical results. Think about, for example, pragmatism, which is probably the first philosophical school that was born in America. But we can see here in pragmatism, generally defined as the philosophy that all that matter, we measure, human actions, ethics, we measure them by results, not by any abstract principles. But we can see here that Machiavelli is enunciating exactly that idea back in the 1500s. So the effectual truth for Machiavelli is in contrast to what? In contrast to the imagination of things. So again, there is this implicit appeal to the way things are, while simultaneously saying the way things are is we don't really care about understanding the way things are. We only care about achieving results. Well, what are these imaginary ideas? Machiavelli doesn't name the names of his opponents, but he indicates his awareness of who they are. He says, many have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist in truth. Now, Plato, the ancient philosopher Plato, who was a student of Socrates, one of his most famous works is The Republic. Later in Roman times, the Roman statesman and philosopher Cicero wrote his own version of The Republic. And so The Republic is one of the most, if not the most influential books on political philosophy before Machiavelli. When he says imagine republics, he is clearly alluding to Plato. Principalities, what is he talking about? There's different options, but in light of Machiavelli's critique of Christianity, his implicit critique of Christianity, I think it's most important here to think about Christ, the Prince of Peace. We saw going all the way back to chapter 6 that Machiavelli does not even mention Christ when he says only armed prophets succeed, even though in his own day the belief system is determined by Christ, who is not an armed prophet. And in a certain sense, Machiavelli is imitating Christ in that he is an unarmed prophet himself, although he is going to, in a sense, be giving arms to his followers. He's going to be showing them where to get arms. So nonetheless, there's this mystery, in the Prince of exactly what does Machiavelli think about Christ? How did Christ get that power if he's not following Machiavelli's rules and if Machiavelli has such contempt for him? But suffice to say here, Machiavelli is suggesting that Plato and Christ are the two sources of what he calls imaginary thinking. And what exactly is at stake here? What is the distinction, between practicality and this imaginary thinking that he's rejecting? He describes it as the distance between how one lives and how one should live. And he says if you let go of how one lives for how one should live, then it leads to your ruin rather than your preservation. So it goes back to success at acquiring what you desire. He's going to call real and effectual, true and effectual, whatever works to get you what you want. If it succeeds at getting you what you want, that is true in a Machiavellian sense. And there's no other standard of truth. Anything else he dismisses as imaginary. And we'll see him unfolding this rhetoric in this and in the subsequent chapters. He's going to keep coming back to that. He's going to keep belittling the more traditional concepts of justice and virtue by saying, oh, that's nice. In an imaginary world, that would be nice. But in the real world, this is how it works. You have to do the opposite. And he elaborates that, if you follow, if you make a profession of good in all regards, then you must come to ruin among so many who are not good. So this is the final piece of this theoretical and anti-theoretical discourse that we're getting here, which is the concept of the good. When we get into Platonic Socratic thought, we will see that the most fundamental concept, the ultimate end or object at which all of our thoughts and actions aim, in terms, there's basically three ways of defining it: the true, the good, and the beautiful, which are various aspects of the same thing. Reality is true, it is good, and it is beautiful, depending on which angle we're looking at it. And Machiavelli here has rejected the classical idea of truth by saying we only care about what works to satisfy desires. We don't care about any other kind of truth. And he rejects the classical idea of the good, again, replacing it simply with the satisfaction of desires. So in other words, if I want something and I can get it, I don't need to ask whether it is good. In fact, it's a waste of time and it's obstructive to ask whether it's good. I should simply ask, do I want it and can I have it? And if the answer is yes on both of those, then go for it. That's what he already said in chapter 3. Now he's making it abundantly clear how this is a very self-conscious rejection of classical ethics, which aims at the true, the good, and the beautiful. And so he says we need to learn. We need to unlearn the classical ethics, and we need to learn how not to be good. That's one of the ways that he expresses his teaching here, learning how not to be good in that Socratic sense of the term. So next, Machiavelli gives us a list of the qualities that typically bring either praise or blame to princes. And it's a list of virtues and vices as understood in classical thinking. So we have things like liberality versus meanness, that is, generosity versus stinginess. We have cruelty versus mercy, faith versus faithlessness, and so on and so forth. So we're not going to go through all these here. Machiavelli is going to go through a couple of these in the next couple of chapters, so we're going to see how he unpacks a few of them. What I want to note at the moment, and we're going to return to this in a minute, how important this is that he dichotomizes these things. He gives us binaries. You're either generous or stingy. You're either faithful or unfaithful. It's one or the other. And that is how he's framing this. And as he is well aware, this is not the way that classical thinkers portray virtue and vice. So we'll look at that a little bit and see how Machiavelli portrays it and how this contrasts to the classical view and why that's so important. But before we do that, just see how he concludes this chapter. And it concludes, again, both his own sort of theoretical presentation to the reader, but also his rhetorical schema for how we're going to talk about these things. And again, he repeats this theme of it would be nice to practice those qualities that are held to be good. But in the real world, you can't do that because it's going to ruin you. So if you have to use the opposites, if you have to be cruel and faithless and so forth, then that's what you have to do. And in the last sentence here, he comes back to his own definition of virtue. He says, if you consider it well, that is, according to the truth, according to him, the effectual truth, you'll find that something appears to be virtue, which if pursued will be one's ruin. And something else appears to be vice, which if pursued results in security and well-being. So in other words, he's saying true virtue is whatever works and succeeds. But what people call virtue is something different. They call virtue more of these traditional kind of virtues of being generous and being honest and all that. And Machiavelli is not attempting to actually eradicate those traditional terms. What he's doing here is basically saying, yeah, the world is always going to judge and it's superficially judge according to those traditional concepts. And you always have to remember that. He's going to go on to say you always have to appear to be honest and merciful and faithful. You always have to appear to have the traditional virtues. But you have to learn how to do the opposite when it's truly virtuous in his definition of virtue. So this becomes a very confusing thing about the Prince, because the term virtue, a lot of times people think Machiavelli is teaching us not to be virtuous. Well, it depends. If you're using a traditional virtue definition of virtue, then yes. Machiavelli is saying you have to pretend to be virtuous but not really be. But he's bolder than that. He's actually saying the true definition of virtue is what I'm saying, which is doing these bad things if that's what works. So we always have to bear this in mind. There's a double definition of virtue going on. Machiavelli does not think that the traditional view of virtue will be eradicated, but he's trying to say keep it there as a smokescreen. Don't actually follow it. So what is that traditional view of virtue, and how does that compare to Machiavelli? We'll be delving into that in a lot more depth in this course, but for now I just want to give a very brief summary of that so we can understand what he's up to in this section of the book. So the traditional notion of virtue, this goes back to, at least back to Socrates in ancient Greece, and this is also part of traditional Christian theology, and you know, many other thinkers, philosophers, and theologians around the world and through the centuries have adopted this. And it's oftentimes referred to as the golden mean. And the premise of this view of virtue is fairly simple, that there is an objective reality, and objective reality gives us the true, the good, and the beautiful. So we certainly have subjective preferences and desires, passions, but they do not define the way things are or what is good. So what those things are and how we apprehend them, we'll get into that later in the course, but assuming that there is some truth, there is some good that we can see it exists independent of our preferences, then the virtuous thing is not only is to know that and to do it, also to love it. So our subjective passions are good as long as they're in line with that objective truth. So this is what we would call the golden mean. The golden mean is not just taking any random two things and going in between it. It starts with the idea of objective truth. And if you think about it like aiming at a target, once you have a target, then you could miss that target in multiple directions. You could be too far to the right or left, too high or too low. So once you have an objective truth, then generally you have at least two different ways of missing it. One would be excess, too much of something that does not serve that objective good, and one would be a defect. So take an obvious example for, say, physical health. A diet, a food that is healthy to eat. You could say that, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Apples are healthy, okay, obviously, but does that mean that it's good to eat 20 or 30 apples a day? Clearly, you're going to run into problems with excess, right? Just as well as, obviously, if you never eat apples, then you're going to be missing something. So once there's an objective reality, then you can either go too far or you can fall short of it. And every virtue is just basically looking at a different option in life, a different choice or question or problem that we confront in life, and saying if there's some best way of responding, then there also will be an excess and there will be a defect compared to that. So for generosity, for example, if we are falling short of generosity, we can call that stinginess. And this is what Machiavelli says. These are the two options, generous or stingy. But actually, in Socratic thought, there's three options, because if you give too much, or if you give to the wrong person at the wrong time, when it's not really helpful, then that's not generosity, because generosity is defined as giving in a beneficial way and in a healthy way. Just like eating, 1 or 2 apples a day, that's healthy. Eating, 50 is not. So generosity, by definition, excludes wastefulness as well as stinginess. And it's the same with every virtue. So if we talk about discipline or authority, exercising authority in a virtuous way, you could fall short of that by being lax, by being lenient, but you could also go too far with cruelty or harshness. And every virtue is that way. So by definition, it's not possible to be ruined by virtue the way that Machiavelli argues here, because built into that question of virtue is that you're following the objective good and the mean. So why does Machiavelli misrepresent classical virtue? I think it's in part because he doesn't want to get into an actual philosophical discussion or argument about this, but also because what he's truly rejecting is, when he says we have to learn how not to be good, he's rejecting the idea of an objective good, an objective truth. The only good or truth that exists is what we desire, and whether we can satisfy it or not. And to ask whether it's good is a nonsensical question. So again, Machiavelli has essentially ignored what the classical philosophers are actually saying. But he clearly is rejecting, he's rejecting the idea of an intrinsic good, or something that's actually good objectively in itself, as opposed to just measuring whether something obtains what I desire or not. And as we get into chapter 16 of liberality and parsimony, or being generous or stingy, Machiavelli is going to give us some context. And I think the context helps to explain his own reasoning about this. Because just as the people in general tend to think in terms of those classical virtues, and they tend to praise people who are generous, for example, but Machiavelli also thinks that the people don't really understand generosity in a Socratic sense. In other words, they're not thinking about the golden mean. And if your goal is to please the people, your goal is to have an alliance with the people, then sticking to a Socratic view of liberality, of generosity, is actually not going to help, because, yeah, on the surface they like generosity, but they don't really understand it in a Socratic sense, and they're not going to give you credit for that. And he says that here by pointing out that if you want a reputation of being liberal or generous, then you have to make lavish displays of generosity. You have to be giving away extravagant amounts of things. So that's what gets you, this is his implicit response, to Plato, is that, yeah, true generosity would not be wasteful, but if you want the reputation for generosity, you have to be wasteful. That's the only thing in the people's mind that's going to make you seem generous, is if you're actually wasteful. So the effectual truth is that generosity is wasteful. Not because you can't conceptualize an ideal generosity, but because you could practice ideal generosity and nobody's going to thank you for it. So as anybody could tell you, wastefulness is a self-destructive strategy. And if appearing generous requires being wasteful, then in the long run, you're going to ruin yourself. And then in order to acquire more of what you're giving away, you're going to end up having to not only be stingy, but actually rapacious, that is, actually robbing people and so forth. So this is not the way to get the people on your side, the short-term benefit of giving too much away will backfire in the long run. So what strategy does Machiavelli recommend? Well, it's very interesting because what he recommends is parsimony, which is a kind of moderation in giving things away, which in a certain sense looks very much like the traditional virtue of generosity, just changing the wording a little bit. But of course, the logic of it is different. It's not because this is the golden mean, this is what is actually good in an objective sense. It's because this is the effectual truth. This is what works at acquiring what you desire, which is power and glory. So the motive is different. But Machiavelli says in the long run, by being prudent and cautious about what you give away, you will give less, but you also take less. And eventually, people will realize that they're better off under your rule because they don't get robbed all the time like they do under more generous rulers. So this is an example, and I think it's important to point out that sometimes a Machiavellian logic will lead to a result that in practice looks identical to a classical, prudence or virtue. Machiavellian virtue is not always going to be at odds with classical virtue in a practical sense, but we can still see the different rationale for it and the potentially different results that it would have when we look at Machiavelli's next statement. Here he has an objector say, but there are princes who became great by being generous, by giving things away. And he says, yes, but if you look at those who did that and succeeded, they were always giving away things that belonged to others, not their own. And that is not their own property, but also not the property of their subjects or their people. So in other words, maybe they conquered a foreign territory and they robbed those people and they used that to pay off their own people. So he says that is virtuous because that's something where it's a win-win for you. You get the reputation of liberality, but you don't have to waste your own goods and then end up having to rob others. So this reminds us that the calculation has nothing to do with the intrinsic goodness of what we're doing. It's simply what works. And sometimes what works will be closer to the behavior of traditional virtue, but at other times what works will be quite the opposite, something that is very unjust or cruel in a traditional sense, but Machiavelli will celebrate it because the results are what you desire. So in chapter 17, Machiavelli looks at another dichotomy, cruelty and mercy. And again, as we saw, in classical terms, there is a golden mean of exercising authority without being lenient or without being harsh. But Machiavelli is going to look at this as a dichotomy. You either have to be cruel or merciful, and too much mercy ends up being cruelty. Because if you are, as again, anybody could have told you this before Machiavelli, if you're too merciful or too lenient, then you allow things to get out of control. There's killings and robberies, and this is not what the people want. The people want to be secure and live a peaceful, comfortable life. And so how do you prevent that? As he had told us before, you have to have executions. You have to have decisive action against the wrongdoers. And that is going to be more merciful in the long run. So again, we could say, well, why does Machiavelli have to talk about it this way? If we use traditional terms, we could simply say that you have to strike the balance between being too harsh or being too lenient. But again, sometimes the results will be the same. If there are actual wrongdoers and you need to punish them to secure the peace, then in classical virtue, that would be a good thing. And in Machiavellian virtue, that would be a good thing. But there are going to be cases where they pull apart. We've already seen previously that, for example, if somebody has not yet done any wrong, but you anticipate that they will in the future, then you preemptively destroy them. So this is definitely something that, in a classical sense, would be hard, if not impossible, to justify. And yet Machiavelli says it has to be your regular policy. And in fact, what really makes somebody bad in your own view is simply that they're a competitor to you. Whether or not there's any actual, just cause against them, you have to pretend that there's a just cause. In his discourses on Livy, which is written about and for republics, Machiavelli actually says that a republic needs to have an execution of traitors at least once every 10 years or so, just to remind people what happens to traitors. And he says if nobody commits treason in about 10 years or so, then somebody needs to frame some people for treason and then execute them. Because it doesn't matter if they're guilty, it only matters that you set the example and everybody believes that they're guilty, or at least believes that they might have been guilty, and this is what happens if you commit treason. So that's when you see the difference of why Machiavelli insists on that this not be presented in traditional ethical terms, because it is not traditional ethics, even if sometimes it overlaps with it. Now Machiavelli raises a question for which he is very famous, and the question is not a new question, but the answer that he gives to it is, as he well knows, precisely the opposite of what previous treatises in politics will give. Is it better to be loved or feared? As we'll see later in the course, in classical thought, the order of society is not only an order of justice, but it's an order of love. And that's because of the nature of human virtue and happiness. That ordering our loves correctly is the way to live a good life. So there's nothing naive about that classical view. They're not thinking that, everybody, society is filled with angels and everybody's all loving and happy. It's simply reflecting this is the nature of human life. This is what actually life is actually about and what actually brings happiness. And it's the only formula that ultimately can make us happy, as hard as it may be to actually instill, an orderly love into society. But Machiavelli completely repudiates this. He's like with all the other classical virtues. It'd be nice if you could, have loving relationships, but in the real life you can't. The world is ugly. So you're going to have to opt for a fear-based relationship with the people. And that's because fear is something that you can control. It never forsakes you, as he says here. And that's the character of virtue for Machiavelli. Obtaining control, things you can control, that's virtue. And so love is not virtuous in his sense because it's something that you can't control. You can love somebody and hope they love you back, but you can't make them. But you can put somebody in a position where they will be afraid of you, and if you're smart, you can keep them afraid of you. So it's under your control, and that makes it virtuous in his sense. However, it's important to see that Machiavelli, although he's not advocating an order of love, he does firmly teach you don't want to be hated. That's a very important distinction. People should fear you, but not hate you. And we're talking about the people as a whole here, because earlier he said, for the ambitious, the great, you have to caress or kill them. So yeah, keep them happy until you get rid of them. For the people who you want a permanent alliance with, you want to keep them fearful. Remember, he said earlier that people were satisfied and stupefied when they saw what Cesare Borgia did. So you want to keep them stupefied or afraid of you, but you don't want them to hate you, because that's when they're going to start looking to support an enemy of yours and go after you. So how can you avoid being hated? This is one of the more important things that Machiavelli says. Especially, this is an important update from chapter 9, where he says, what do the people want? They want to be not commanded or oppressed. They want to be left alone. Here he's a little bit more specific about what the people want. He says, you can always avoid being hated by the citizens if you abstain from two things: their property and their women. So this is how he characterizes the desires of the people, whom he called decent in chapter 9. The people want to be left alone with their property and their women. And if you don't mess with those things, they are basically not going to care about anything else that you do. They will fear you because they know if they cross you, they're in trouble. But they don't have any reason to cross you if you let them have their property and their women. So they will be content with that situation. And just to drive home what he means by the decency of the people and what he does not mean by the decency of the people, he concludes this advice by saying that men forget the death of a father more quickly than the loss of a patrimony. In Italian, that is almost like a pun. It's a joke because the word patrimony, meaning inheritance, is connected to the word patre, father. So it's your father and what you get from your father when he dies, your inheritance. And between the two of them, Machiavelli says, people care more about their inheritance than their father. So if you had to kill somebody as an enemy, but their children are not ambitious and they're just going to be happy with inheriting their property, let them have the property, because then they're not going to hate you even though you killed their father. So this is, Machiavellian moderation, because notice there's a kind of moderation here. He's saying, don't take certain things. You might desire that property. You might desire that woman. Don't take them, because that's going to set up enmities, hatreds that are just going to complicate your scheme for power and glory. So if you want maximum power and glory, you'll have to refrain from some things that are going to interfere with that. So there is a kind of Machiavellian moderation. It's very important to see this, but it is not based on truth or justice, as we can see, or love, as we can see from this analysis. It is based on a kind of mutual, selfish behavior between the prince and the people. Let the people have their property, let the prince have his power, and everybody's happy, except for maybe the few who have to get eliminated to make that work. Now in chapter 18, which we alluded to earlier when Machiavelli had talked about Louis invading Italy and what he should have done with the Pope, and he kind of pointed forward to this chapter and what mode faith should be kept by princes. So as we noted, there's a double entendre here with the word faith. On the surface, it means keeping your promises, and Machiavelli is saying, don't keep your promises. You need to break your promises. You need to lie and betray people. But of course, connected to that with the example of the Pope, which he brings back up again in chapter 18, he uses Alexander VI, the Pope who thwarted King Louis. He uses him as an example as the greatest liar of his own time period. He said he was the most successful liar. He always lied, and people always believed him because he was so good at it. So that lying is a virtue in Machiavelli's view, and you need to know how to do it well. Again, he's getting a little more philosophical in this section. So one of the things he's doing here is he goes back to the concept of laws. Earlier he had said laws are good if you can enforce them. Here he talks about law as being a mode of combat, which goes along with that earlier statement. But he mentions that law in itself is proper to man as opposed to brute force, which is proper to beasts. But if you're reducing law to a type of force, then basically what you're doing is saying there's nothing that is truly distinctive about human beings compared to animals. We appear to be different, and we certainly have some different characteristics, but they're not fundamentally important, because all we're doing with our unique characteristics like reason and speech and thought, which are all embodied in law, all we're doing with that is simply satisfying our desires by any possible means. So he's going to go on to say, he starts by saying you have to be able to be, human and inhuman, use the man and use the beast, but his examples are all going to be beasts. He's going to say you should be like the fox, which is tricky and clever to avoid other people's snares, and also use some snares of your own against other people, and the lion, who uses brute strength. You have to mix and match those things according to the occasion. So the human part, the rational part, ends up collapsing into the fox, which is that reason and speech and law are just, and beliefs, religious beliefs, are just clever tricks and snares that you can use to get the things that you want. So Machiavelli now reiterates what he had said before, which is you have to pretend to have the classical virtues while not actually having them. so that you can follow his virtue to success while appearing to have those other virtues. And we'll notice here that one of the virtues you have to appear to have is religion without actually having it. Another is humanity, and it's translated here as humane, but the word in Italian could be translated as human. So you have to pretend to be human without really being human. Just kind of reinforcing what we said before is that Machiavelli, in distinguishing between the man and the beast, essentially dismisses the human part of that and says that it's not real, it's just an appearance. It's just a different way of obtaining what the beasts obtain through different means. And finally, he brings it back around to the dynamics of how is this going to succeed in the eyes of the people. And as we've seen before, the people want the traditional virtues to some extent, but they don't really care about them. And the way he puts that here is that people judge more by their eyes than their hands. So everybody sees how you appear, but few touch to see how you really are. And so that's the way that you have to deal with morality, traditional morality versus his, Machiavellian virtue. You have to practice the Machiavellian virtue, pretend to have the traditional morality, but knowing that nobody really cares that much. So you do have to pretend, but your pretense doesn't have to be that deep. And the few people who will probe further and find out that you're different, those are going to be the few. And we already know the few are there to be eliminated, and they have to be considered enemies of the people to justify that. And so Machiavelli says here, the few who find out who you really are, they will not dare to oppose you, who have the majesty of the state to defend you, as long as the people are on your side. So he comes back around to the conclusion from chapter 3. If you succeed, you'll be praised and not blamed. But we have a much more in-depth review of exactly what that takes and how that works. And we can see here, for example, that you're always going to have potential critics, the few who are more astute and maybe more ambitious. You're always going to have to be on your guard, and your tactic will always be to isolate them and say, it's you and the people against them. So you'll have to make it look like they're questioning you because they want to hurt the people. And we have at this point a whole bag of tricks that we can use, right? We can accuse them of troublemaking and bringing about violence and contention and things that will threaten, the people's safety. We can accuse them of trying to take the people's property or women. We can accuse them of essentially trying to deprive the people of the things that they desire. And we'll reflect more on this later, but I think this is very important to see at this point, that in the Machiavellian worldview, the prince or the state is going to be promising to satisfy the people's desires that do not compete with the state, their desire for property, their desire for pleasure, their desire for safety, the things that the state can provide or allow them to have without conflict. And to eliminate anyone who questions the prince or the state, they will have to be framed as people who either want to directly take those things away from the people, or perhaps through moral teachings, through philosophical or religious teachings, are trying to tell the people not to go after those things. Don't go after property. Don't go after women. That can be portrayed as kind of a psychological threat. They're trying to take away your pleasure in life. So there's a whole bunch of possibilities that Machiavelli has laid out here in this section of the book. Not for a true philosophical exchange with other views, but for an effectual truth kind of way of deflecting and combating these competing ideas to make them look bad and to make people think that your presentation of morality, even though it's really Machiavellian, is actually, looks pretty good because you make it look good, and it also satisfies their desires. So basically making this Machiavellianism popular is what he is formulating in this section.